Good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for the tech difficulties on my end here. My name is Jadwiga Biskupska, and I'm Associate Professor of Military History at Sam Houston State University in Huntsville, Texas. And I'm coming to you as host of this exciting presentation today, wearing two hats, metaphorically, as a participant in our graduate MA program here at Sam Houston State University in War and Violence and part of its ongoing virtual programming, and as the co-director of the Second World War Research Group North America. And we are, as the Second World War Research Group North America, having an all-day virtual seminar tomorrow on different aspects of atrocity and excess in the Second World War, to which I know a number of you are attending, and to which all of you are invited. And I'm very excited today to introduce a colleague who'll be talking about his recent work, and he'll be talking with us for about 45 minutes, and then I'll open things up for the Q&A. For those of you who are not familiar with Zoom seminar formats, on the bottom of your screen should be a double bubble that says Q&A, in which you can enter your questions, and we'll queue those up for Dr. Westermann after he's done with his presentation. Before we get started and before I introduce him, I'd like to thank several of my colleagues who've made this possible. I'd like to thank the chair of my department, Dr. Brian Matthew Jordan, for helping to support this and for supporting our ongoing MA program in War and Violence, my colleague, Dr. Benjamin Park, who runs our graduate program, and the College of Humanities and Social Sciences here at Sam Houston State University. I'd also like to thank my co-director in the Second World War Research Group North America, Mary Catherine Barbier, for helping me plan this talk and our workshop tomorrow. All right, now on to our main event. Dr. Edward Westermann received his doctorate from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and he is currently Regents Professor of History at Texas A&M University in San Antonio. He's published extensively on both the Holocaust and on military history, and he is the author of Hitler's Ostkrieg and the Indian Wars, Comparing Genocide and Conquest from Oklahoma in 2016, Hitler's Police Battalions Enforcing Racial War in the East from Kansas in 2005, and Flak, German Anti-Aircraft Defenses from 1914 to 1945, also from Kansas. He is a former Fulbright Fellow at the Free University of Berlin, a three-time Fellow of the German Academic Exchange Service, the DAAD, a Fellow of Keene State University's College Genocide Studies and Prevention Program, and J.B. and Morris C. Shapiro Fellow at the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. From January 2019 until September of 2021, he also served as commissioner on the Texas Holocaust and Genocide Commission. His latest book, which he'll be speaking about with us today, is called Drunk on Genocide, Alcohol and Mass Murder in Nazi Germany, and it appeared last year with Cornell University Press. I will now turn things over to him, and as he speaks, if you have questions or comments, please begin to queue them up in the Q&A, and we'll turn to them after he's done with his presentation. Dr. Westermann, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jadwiga. I'm going to go ahead and try to share screen here now. So, and hopefully you can see that. I want to say thank you, Jadwiga, to you. I want to say thank you to Catherine as well, and to the entire Second World War Research Group North America for this opportunity. And it looks like just a fantastic program that you all have put together. So I really appreciate the opportunity to kick it off here today. And thanks to those who are here. And as Jadwiga talked about, what I'd like to share with you is some of the information and observations that I gained in this latest book. And I'll start with a couple of photos. And the photo you see on your screen right now is actually from Police Battalion 101. They're outside the Łódź Ghetto. It's Christmas of 1940. And there's really nothing remarkable about this photo. It's Christmas time, they're drinking, they're having a celebration. And that's something we would expect across the Eastern Front, and matter of fact, across Europe at the time, potentially. However, this is another photo from that same Christmas celebration. And what you'll see here is three policemen have dressed up one of their colleagues as a Jewish man who has now been caught with a basket smuggling in or out of the ghetto. And what you need to know on the context of this photo is over the last month, Police Battalion 101 has been interdicting smugglers in and out of the ghetto and has made regular use of their weapons against Jews doing such smuggling. So it's very interesting to me that the men thought it would be funny to include as a skit in their Christmas celebration the idea of interdicting Jews and in fact referencing the idea of murder. So as I started this project, I actually had my initial question was just looking at how alcohol, what role did alcohol play and what role did drinking rituals play among the perpetrators of mass killing. And as I continued to go forward with this project, it became clear to me it wasn't just a question of literal intoxication and drinking, but this metaphorical intoxication, that the so-called Ostrausch, or Eastern intoxication, if you will, the control of the bodies and lands of others. And then as I continued to think more about the project as it was developing towards the monograph, I started to look at the way in which these men saw themselves in terms of masculinity and how these conceptions of masculinity played or were integrated into acts of sexual violence and mass murder or killing. And then finally, one of the most interesting insights that I'll be focusing on today for me was the way in which celebratory ritual was included into these perpetrators' actions and what insights that gives us the behaviors and actions of these men into their actual motivations. Now, it's probably no surprise that if we talk about roles and functions of alcohol here, social bonding and celebration are part of it. We've all had birthday celebrations, anniversaries, finishing your PhD, defending, whatever the case might be. Ritual, the types of way we drink, where we drink, competition. So when I talk about drinking games, for example, that incorporated some of my students, beer pong, for example, is something they can relate to. But how is drinking done amongst individuals? And then again, for those who are familiar with university environments, this intersection of alcohol, masculinity, and physical and sexual violence is something that we read about really every month. And so the way in which perceptions of masculinity also incorporate ideas related to the use of one's physical power in fighting another individual, for example, or in acts of sexual violence. The selective disinhibition, this is what I tell my students, is the so-called spring break effect. And what I mean by that is when they get down to the Daytona Beach Hotel that's on the third floor that overlooks the pool at 10 in the morning, they're not thinking about, hey, it'd be a good idea to jump off the balcony into the pool. But maybe that night at midnight after they've been drinking all day, when someone says, I bet you can't make it, then all of a sudden it sounds like a good idea. So the way in which alcohol disinhibits our actions is something I want to talk about as well. And facilitation, how in the East alcohol facilitated additional acts of violence is something I want to focus on. And it's very important to understand that alcohol was an incentive and reward for the killers in the East, for both local collaborators as well as SS and policemen. And then what I've left at the end here is coping mechanism. Because if you were to look at most of the literature, if someone talks about alcohol, it's normally one or two lines, maybe a paragraph, and it invariably comes down to the only way these men could do what they did was by drinking. And I want to try to complicate that explanation a little bit as we move forward in this discussion. This pretty much lays out what the book looks like. And what I want to reiterate with this is rituals of humiliation. So we know many of these, the cutting off of beards, of side locks, the making of individuals clean streets with toothbrushes or with their underwear or clothing. These are things that we know exist in the literature on the Holocaust, but they don't necessarily have to be associated with drinking. This again is the metaphorical intoxication, control over other individuals that I want to talk about. Just in the same ways that talking about masculinity, trophies, and hunting can be seen as masculine ideas. And this is from a quote that I pulled from Omer Bartov's book on Buchach, The Anatomy of Genocide. And what I really found striking in Omer's book here is he talks about how murder is not only normalized, but the removal of Jews became part of a day's work as entertainment. And he says that that's rarely reflected on in post-war representations and ruminations, let alone the historiography. Well, I think he's half right. Actually, when you start looking at the testimony, you see a great deal of witnesses, survivors, in some cases perpetrators, who reflect on these ideas, what's actually happening. But the historiography really hasn't caught up with that. I think he's correct there. So looking at this idea of celebratory ritual, I think it's also important as historians we kind of define our terms here. And I'm going to be talking about masculinity. And of course, masculinity as a concept is malleable. It changes over time. It's socially constructed, and it exists against this kind of feminine ideal. And in the case of most literature today dealing with masculinity, they use the term hegemonic masculinity. So what's the dominant masculine paradigm for that given period? Now, when I was looking at Nazi Germany, however, there are historians who've talked about this idea of hypermasculinity. And I feel that that's a better description. And the way in which hypermasculinity works, it's a very clear indication of a type of militarized masculinity that I'll talk about. And it's tied to performative masculinity. So men competing with men. I've got several examples I'd like to share with you. And in the book, this is the way I essentially define my term when talking about hypermasculinity. This extreme conception, if you will, of militarized masculinity within this rigid patriarchal racial hierarchy that links sexuality, racism, and the practice of racial war with German manhood. So when I'm using the term, this is what I'm referring to. Now, I think it's very important when we talk about this topic that this doesn't start on January 30th, 1933, when Hitler becomes chancellor. In fact, these behaviors that I'm going to be talking about exist already in the 1920s and early 1930s, before the Nazis come to power. And where they find their clearest manifestations are in the essay pubs, Kneipen, the essay homes, the essay Heime, in which these men gather together. They have rituals of drinking, they have militarized rituals, uniform inspections, reading of orders, witnesses coming and talking about the First World War, but it becomes a male environment. And I think that that's important to stress. So for example, in these essay Kneipen, women aren't allowed into these spaces. It's a male-dominated and male-exclusive space. And what you see is if there is a special event in which women are allowed into these bars, they're not allowed to drink. They can drink limonadas or soft drinks and water. So again, we're seeing how the space itself becomes gender. The men boast amongst each other, and this performative masculinity starts to take place. And one of the things that I was not expecting to find was this importance of song and music. And song and music in vocal violence, if you will, is one way to think about it, but also in promoting violence and political violence. So these sites become sites of male camaraderie, but they're also sites in which men get together before going out to go look for communists, social democrats, to go look for their enemies in this case. And a quote that I have here that kind of relates back to this power of music is in fact Abraham Plotkin, who's a US labor organizer who goes to a Nazi rally, and he's really impressed with the way in which music, its ferocity, its volume is used. And when one looks at diary entries from German Jews, this is also something they remark about hearing these stormtrooper songs, about the way in which on the street, in public spaces, the lyrics and the ferocity, if you will, of the song is directed at them, and they're remembering what that meant. We also again see that these sites become sites, waypoints, if you will, that lead to further violence, public violence in this period before the Nazis take power. Now, Donald Bloxham has talked about this idea of zones of exception, and certainly Eastern Europe after the Nazi invasion in the east of Poland and into the Soviet Union becomes, as he talks about, a zone of exception. But before the war, zones of exception exist in the concentration camps within Germany itself. And what we see is these rituals of humiliation, violence and amusement of the perpetrators in acts of violence that they perform, competitions between guards that deal with the ability to knock out a prisoner, for example. You have a number of individuals who go by the nickname the Boxer, for example, in the SS Guard Corps. And their claim to fame, for example, is the ability to knock out prisoners with a single blow. You see competitions that prisoners talk about how SS men compete against each other in beatings, and we can return to that a little bit later. The incorporation of murder games, so entertainment, violence and killing as a type of entertainment as well. And in the witness testimony that I've shown below, the witness is talking again in terms of what he's seen. And he's talking about guards amusing themselves and debasing or humiliating the prisoners. And I think that term amusement is an important term, because what we're starting to see is if we look at the way in which these guards their actions are interpreted by the victims and by bystanders or by observers, it's in terms of their enjoyment of these acts. And even in the case of Rudolf Höss, who everyone here will certainly know was a commandant at Auschwitz. This is from his, if you will, death row memoir. He himself speculates on how SS guards used flogging or beatings as a kind of entertainment. And I think that that's an important term when we start to think about the terms that are used to describe these actions. Another thing that, as I said, that music is an important part of this, and the way in which music is used to stage events. And in the camps, these Sunday concerts, the use of prisoners to perform for the guards. And in this case, Rudolf Reda is remembering how the scraps of food are thrown like you would almost to a pet or to an animal. And the picture at the left, which is from the Johann Niemann collection of Sobibor, this is the SS canteen, restaurant, bar area at Sobibor in the camp. And what one needs to understand is these SS men go there to decompress after their day of work. And at a site that is literally only several hundred meters away from where mass murder is taking place, this is the place that they gather. And when you think about that, one of the things that sometimes goes missing is that many who live in the area of Sobibor, Treblinka, or Belzec remember the smell. And they remember that is like for miles around in some cases. So we have to also think about men who are entering these spaces and entering these rituals and the types of atmosphere that is created within those spaces. Now, earlier I talked about the idea and the importance of facilitation. And in this case, what we have is a survivor's testimony about SS men coming in, these drunken SS men coming into the ghetto. And she writes that they invaded the ghetto and embarked upon a killing spree. The German term in this case is Gaudi, kind of having a good time, if you will. And she says, again, these Gestapo men killed lots of people, quote, as a sport. And I think, again, this is where we have to take the witness testimony. We have to really think about the words. So she's interpreting their enjoyment. They're doing this as a type of sport. If we look at Yiddish, the so-called Verbandsprache, the language of destruction, one of the things that we see in looking at these witness accounts of what's happening in these mass murders is they're using the idea of a wedding metaphor. And so as I was thinking about a wedding metaphor, if you were in a small shtetl or a small Jewish community in the East, what would probably be the most joyous day of the year for a small community? It would be something like a wedding. There would be food, there would be drink, there would be music. So as the victims and as the witnesses are watching what these German murder squads are doing, they are equating that with a wedding metaphor because they're trying to frame these actions in a language that they understand. And again, I think sometimes linguistically we move by that too quickly. Now, with respect to this testimony, the most interesting part of this testimony for me is actually the date that it occurs. So it's New Year's Eve, 1942. So what does that mean? Like many of us on New Year's Eve, we would be celebrating and bringing in the new year and maybe drinking while we're doing that. These SS men were doing that. And how did they decide that they wanted to start the new year? The way they decided they wanted to start the new year was by going into the ghetto and killing Jews. And I think that's really an important point. This is facilitation. In other words, this is not guys that are laying with their head down on the bar, worried about what they've been involved in. These are men that want to start the new year the way they've ended the old, by killing Jews. And so again, not being able to climb into the minds of the perpetrators, these behaviors and actions, I think, give us some real insights into motivation. Some of you may be familiar with these pictures. This is the so-called Kochmalna bar in the Warsaw Ghetto, named for a street within the ghetto. And members of Police Battalion 61, this is their police bar. And if you look at the photo on the left, probably the first thing that strikes you about that bar area is they've hung up a Star of David as a light fixture, a very cynical use, incorporation of the Star of David into the bar itself. And if we were standing at that bar and we started to turn around and to look at the room, the other thing that we would immediately notice is there's a bunch of hand-drawn murals on the wall. And these murals were drawn by the policemen, and they depict their duties in the ghetto. In fact, one of them shows a Jewish man reaching down to pick up a potato with a policeman and his rifle leveled behind him, getting ready to shoot them. So this is the environment in which these men are coming off duty to celebrate. Now, another thing that would have struck us if we had gone to that ghetto bar in 1940 would have been that as we got to that door of that bar, the thing that we would have immediately noticed was that there are notches in groups of 5 that were carved into that door. And ultimately, there'll be about 500 notches carved into that door. So what does that mean? It meant that men coming off duty, the first thing that they did before going into the bar was to go ahead and annotate their kills for the day on the bar. And again, this performative nature, I think, gives us, again, another idea of what that looks like. The idea of music has been discussed in some accounts, and especially with the Erntefest, the Harvest Festival massacre in Treblinka. And when one sees the discussion of the Harvest Festival in November of 1943, it talks about how the Germans played this music, martial music, over the loudspeakers of the camp at Majdanek, Majdanek. And as they're doing that, it's been interpreted they're trying to drown out the shooting that's taking place. Well, having been on a military firing range with automatic weapons, you don't drown out shooting of automatic weapons. And in fact, after the event, there's one policeman who says it's really cool to shoot to martial music. He tells one of his friends that. And what we see here is the incorporation of music as part of staging. And in this case, I've underlined in my mind a key word. When we look at what's happening at Sachsenhausen, SS murder orgies grew into real parties, festa, and thinking about what that word means, the word that's being used is a word that describes celebration and celebratory ritual. And the idea of music accompanying this kind of abuse gets us into the mindset, if you will, of the perpetrators. Just as the idea of having perpetrators who have an accordion, a guy sitting around playing the accordion at the actual killing sites for the enjoyment and entertainment of his fellow perpetrators. And one of the things that I think also Patrick Dubois' Holocaust by Bullets work really did well in looking at those witnesses from the Ukrainians who remembered what they saw in these killings that the Germans were conducting. The way in which they said they sat around and ate and drank. They were drinking and singing. They only wanted the best pieces of meat. And to think about this in terms of what that means, that if there's a gravesite, if there's a grave pit, a murder site that's 20 meters away from where a table and food and drink are set up, it means that men are going to the gravesite, they're shooting their victims, they're literally being covered in the body and blood matter of their victims, and they're going back and sitting down at a table and eating and drinking. That physiological obstacle that many would feel in being involved in this is no longer there for men who can go back and forth from the table and eat and drink and kill. And I think, again, that brings us to the idea of how murder is normalized, and also how the perpetrators themselves see it, and singing again is part of that. We also see the way in which men perform for women. And this is one example in which sometimes even women are brought to these sites as a way in which the idea being that they would be impressed by what these men can do. And in the book, I talk about one particular example. It's a policeman who comes back from a killing action, and he likes a secretary, a German secretary. And so instead of first going back to his barracks and cleaning off and changing his uniform, what he does is he actually goes to see the secretary. Now, I don't know what her response was to that, but I know what his perception or expectation was, that by seeing her in that state, she would be impressed by his hardness and his toughness. So we see also the ways in which performative masculinity is incorporated into male-female relations in the East. And again, here, another case where a member of Police Battalion 303 talked about an execution, and he described in an interrogation a band that was playing at the execution as the Jews were led away. And he stated it was loud, just like a folksfest, a carnival. And again, I think this is, again, taking the perpetrators at their words. So the language at which he's using is also an indication of the type of setting or the way the setting's being interpreted, even by the perpetrators in this case, and not the witness. And we know in the case of performative masculinity, I have several examples where men remember how they kept score against each other. And they would go to the bar in some cases and brag about who had the lead, who had the highest kill count, if you will, in this case. And this was one example. The second, that was one of the most, the ones that really struck me, because it's from a testimony of a German administrator after the war. And he remembered in 1942, he's going into the Deutsches Haus. So this restaurant bar area that's for German nationals only in the East. And he remembered how he heard this celebration going on. And as he reaches for the door to go in to the Deutsches Haus, he sees an SS guy coming out. And he has a beer coaster, and it's pinned to his uniform tunic. And on the beer coaster, the number 1000 is inscribed in red ink. And when the administrator asks him, hey, what are you doing? The man says, the SS man says, today I'm celebrating my 1000th Knickschuss, literally a shot in the back of the neck. In other words, he's been keeping score and he's reached 1000, and that's room for a special celebration. We also see that dynamic in the so-called T4 or so-called euthanasia program, in which individuals, the so-called burners, would celebrate hitting round numbers. In this case, I have an example of Grafeneck and one burner celebrating his 20,000. But at Hadamar, they celebrate the 10,000 killing as well. They celebrate it with beer and music and a party. So we see the way in which these celebratory rituals are integrated into mass murder. And in fact, the same thing happens at Treblinka. With the deportation of the Warsaw Jews in the summer and fall of 1942 to Treblinka, as they reach, they're keeping count how many Jews have been killed. And as they reach the number 100,000, it's time for a party that night with additional alcohol and additional celebration because they've reached that number. So again, I think what this tells us, or what this shows us, is the way in which the killers themselves are looking at the actions that they're involved in and how they're celebrating them. This to me was a very interesting testimony. It's a Polish woman, and many here will of course know that Sobibor, the actual train station, is a train station used not only for the deportation trains, but also for commercial traffic. And it's very close to the camp. And this Polish woman, what she wanted was she wanted to find some cigarettes. And so she's standing at Sobibor, and she hears this music and laughter and voices behind a door. And so she decides she's going to go in there and see if she can get some cigarettes. And as you see in the testimony, she describes these richly covered tables with these numbers of bottles with foreign labels, alcohol, and excess food. And immediately, for those of us who think about the Holocaust and what's happening at a place like Sobibor, we understand that foreign food, that alcohol, that comes from the deportations themselves. But she also remembers that these SS men and these Travniki, these ethnic auxiliaries, were in a drunken state, and the word she used is they amused themselves and told stories about their families. So she's interpreting how they're responding to that environment. And she further remembered this large SS man who's playing the balalaika with this especially or unusually valuable ring on his finger. So we see the setting, if you will, of how these men are decompressing, if you will, after a day's mass murder. Now, the other thing I would point out is that Sobibor was actually the site of an archaeological expedition several years ago. An Israeli, Dutch, and Polish team actually was on the arrival ramp. And what you see here are some of the artifacts that they were able to find there. Now, I've circled the one ring because, again, thinking about the balalaika player, where did he get that ring? Well, he got it from the goods, if you will, that were taken from those who were killed. And this is just an example of the types of plunder that were available to the killers at these sites. Johann Kremer offers another example of an SS man, now an SS doctor, who has a very short diary. Most of his diary entries maybe are a paragraph, in some cases only 2 or 3 lines. But his diary entry from 8 November 1942 starts with his description of his participation in his 12th and 13th mass gassing. And then he transitions in that very short entry to a cozy evening company that included Bulgarian red wine and Croatian plum brandy. This juxtaposition of coziness, of camaraderie with mass murder, I think is especially striking in this case. And for those who are familiar, obviously, with the Wannsee Conference, one of the things we know about the conference that seems at least paradoxical or out of place is the end of the conference and the way it ends with Heydrich and Eichmann and Müller sitting around drinking cognac and smoking cigars. But something that may be less known to the audience is Eichmann, in his testimony in Jerusalem, remembers another time subsequent to Wannsee when he met with Heydrich. And those who today here will remember that Heydrich is going to be assassinated in May of 1942. So sometime between the end of January and May of 1942, Heydrich remembers, Eichmann remembers going to meet Heydrich. And he talks, we sang a song, we drank, we climbed up on a chair and drank again, and then onto the table, a type of merrymaking I had not known. And to think in context what this means, what would be the reason that an SS lieutenant colonel would be going to see Heydrich in the time between the Wannsee Conference and Heydrich's assassination? And the reason would be he was going to update his boss on how the final solution was going. And the news must have been pretty good if it ended up with this drinking party and singing on top of the table. Again, another manifestation of celebratory ritual. We have also pictures in the East. This is a Wehrmacht unit celebrating Christmas in the East, and you see the various bottles there that are on the table. And Ilya Ehrenberg talks about, as a Red Army journalist and propagandist, he talks in his writing in 1942 about how these German troops are violating women and hanging men. They are guzzling alcohol and sleeping off their orgies like swine. And for some of us, we might say, well, we would expect that that would have a propaganda flavor to it coming from someone like Ehrenberg. But if we also look at German soldiers' letters, in this case, a letter from a German soldier home, a Feldpostbrief in 1944, in which he says, the way it's hoarded and guzzled here is incredible. This next picture is really striking, and I appreciate Bas Willems for giving this to me and sending it to me. These are two SS men. It's winter of 1943, and they're chugging, and what you might not be able to see is they're chugging champagne. And actually, they're chugging French champagne. It's Moet and Chandon. So how does French champagne get to the East? It gets to the East because hundreds of thousands of bottles of red wine, of champagne, of German beer are sent to the troops in the East. And these guys are involved in a contest to see who can actually finish their bottle first. A kind of, if you will, banal manifestation of this behavior, but it gives us insights into the kind of ubiquity, if you will, of alcohol and its use. Another picture, again, with French champagne and men, in this case, Wehrmacht men in the East. Now, in kind of closing this, the presentation, what are some of the key insights that I would like to share with you all in thinking about the project? Well, I think alcohol has been a topic that's hiding in plain sight. So if you go looking for the alcohol bottle in the haystack, actually you can find it quite a bit once you're attuned to it. It's there quite a bit. We know that alcohol is part of this shared group identity and mission. But what's really important to stress here is that the Holocaust happens with or without alcohol. It's neither necessary nor sufficient for the killing that takes place. But the way it's used by the perpetrators gives us insights into their mindset and the way in which they also chose to stage murder. And I think that's important. And some of you will be familiar with the historiography that also talks about coping, also sometimes talks about men like Jekyll or von den Bach or Karl Jaeger, men who it says had trouble sleeping and they had intestinal and stomach problems. And oftentimes that's interpreted as a psychosomatic manifestation of the actions that they've been involved in. But if you look at the medical literature related to high alcohol use, what you also see is sleep deprivation, sleep problems, and stomach ulcers, intestinal problems are physiological manifestations of that drinking. Now, I'm not saying that it necessarily means that the psychosomatic analysis is wrong, but again, I think we need to complicate that narrative, just like we need to complicate the narrative of coping. And certainly coping happens. And as I talked about, there are multiple functions of alcohol that we need to look at. And it can change over time for specific perpetrators in specific situations. And the final thing, if I could share with you, this is actually a picture that came from an earlier book that I did on the police. And this is a young woman. She's being interrogated by a security service interrogator. And those are policemen behind her. And that young woman is with that little boy. And I can talk a lot about theories of masculinity and perpetrator motivation, but that can sound pretty academic. What this picture has always reminded me of is it's about the individuals who are involved. And as many will know, this is part of the so-called Judenjagd anti-partisan campaign. And a woman and a little boy who are found out in the woods without papers, this might have been the very last record of her life and of that boy's life, because I don't know what happened to these two individuals, but I do know in tens of thousands of cases, those found in those situations would have been that last moment before their execution. So I think that this is a picture that reminds me it's not about academic theory, it's about individuals. So I'm going to go ahead and try to stop my share here, and I look forward to your comments and your questions.
Thank you so much for that talk, Dr. Westermann. It's a disturbing subject to ponder. For those of you who are adding your questions to the Q&A, I'll turn to those in a moment, but I'm seizing the opportunity to ask a question or two myself. So please fill in your questions and comments in the Q&A, and we'll get to those. And I can also allow some of you to speak in here as well, so we can have a discussion. Dr. Westermann, I wanted to ask you two questions, and one of them is, I think, a bit more concrete. It's about logistics and supply. And I was glad you brought in that photo of the French champagne, because as I was reading through this book, I kept thinking, and maybe it's a bit of American puritanicalism, but that this is just an enormous amount of alcohol. And alcohol takes up a lot of space at a time when the Eastern Front is having supply problems, and it's sensitive to temperature and things. And the amount of alcohol that's being supplied certainly indicates how much of a priority this is for the Wehrmacht and the SS. But I was also curious in the background whether any of this alcohol was being sourced locally, because in the general government in occupied Poland, there's also a deep controversy among the underground and among occupied peoples about the distilling of alcohol and the way the occupations restrict this, and it becomes a cultural and a political and a moral issue. So I was wondering if is there local supply here, or is this just fancy Western European supply being brought in?
No, absolutely. So yeah, it's a great question, because again, as you know, there's a tradition of home brew in Eastern Europe. And so what we have in that case is we have, especially some of the local collaborators, the local auxiliaries are involved in that, but you also have the Travniki guards are involved. For example, they leave the camps and go to local stores. And in one case, the Travniki, the SS guard, throws down on the counter, he throws down gold teeth that still have flesh attached to it. And he wants to get a bottle of home brew, of vodka, if you will, from the owner of that store. So you do see a trade in this. You also see, looking at Auschwitz, for example, and the daily orders that are issued in Auschwitz, that drinking is widespread. Water is also of poor quality in the East in many cases. And so just like in colonial America, if you look at the history of colonial America, many people started their day off with hard cider and not water during the day because of that. So what you see is you also see the substitution if you will, of water for alcoholic beverages. But you see, in the case of Auschwitz, you also see several cases where individual guards are warned not to drink methyl alcohol. So you even see bootleg alcohol that is harmful, and so you do see this kind of illicit trade in alcohol. But one of the things that's most striking is the availability of alcohol in the East, and how widespread, whether it's coming, as you said, from the occupied territories, or in the case of Joseph Goebbels, who's the Gauleiter of Berlin. In his role as Gauleiter of Berlin, he sends these 100,000 bottles of schnapps to the East from his district in Berlin. So you see the way in which that trade takes place, or that transfer, if you will, takes place.
It's a grisly thing to ponder. I'm going to ask one more question, which would piggyback us into the Q&A, which I'll turn to. And it's about, you talked a good bit about your source base, but I was wondering if we can trace this in any way into the post-war, because the kind of excessive consumption we're talking about and the behavior that these men are engaged in seems like it would have consequences for them in the long term, in terms of their life expectancy, their liver health. Do we see a post-war trace of this, of alcoholism, of alcohol-related problems, of mental health problems that may be adjacent to this? Can we pick up this story into the post-war? Does it end for us in 19?
Yeah, that's another really good question. And what I do is I want to back up first, because Pete Hamill, who wrote a book, he's a journalist in New York, A Drinking Life, and Pete Hamill remembers growing up in working class neighborhoods in New York. And what he talks about those working class bars in New York in the 1940s, what he remembers about them with his dad and his buddies that were there, as he said, there was two things that highlighted your ability as a man in those spaces. Number one, they tended to be male-only spaces. Women weren't allowed in the front of the bar. They had to be in the back of the bar if they were in the bar at all. And the men, your ability to hold your liquor was one example of your toughness and your ability to use your fists. So some of these ideas of drinking and masculinity, they cut across cultural differences. The types of things that people drink may be different: schnapps versus beer versus bourbon, whatever the case. But I think that's important to remember. And the other thing is that our conceptions of drinking are socially constructed. So some of you may have watched Mad Men. It's about this 1950s advertising company in New York. And what we see, if you watch that show, what's striking to us today is they have a 10 o'clock meeting in the morning, and they're drinking, they're drinking highballs, or they're drinking bourbon. They go to lunch and they're drinking a couple of martinis. They come back and they have a 3 o'clock meeting and they're drinking again, and they go home and they have martinis at home. And from our perspective today, we're going, well, these guys are all alcoholics. But what we kind of fail to think about is how alcohol itself, and the amount of alcohol and the way we drink alcohol is itself of a given time and place. And I think that, again, we want to see these guys as alcoholics in some way to say that that explains their behavior, and that becomes difficult. Now, the second part of your question that I think is a really great question: how do men who have become acculturated to that kind of drinking and that kind of violence reintegrate with their families in post-war Germany? And I think that the idea of like domestic violence, and that to me would be a fascinating subject to continue to pursue. What I do know is that it's sometimes a result of the abuse of the spouse that you see women go to the local police, and then they're telling, okay, my husband's beating me. And as they're being interviewed, what they also say, and oh, by the way, you should hear what he and his buddies talk about, what they did in the war. And so some of these investigations that come out of these SS and police units actually come as a result of the behaviors that the men are directing against their spouses. And that's where we see it. So that's indirect evidence that men who've become, if you will, normalized to this kind of behavior, that they continue that kind of behavior. But I would love to see a study that goes further in that direction.
I would too, if you don't have anything to do for your next project. Let's turn to some of the questions here in the Q&A. We have a number of these coming in, and I'll read them off so that everyone can hear them if you're not looking at them right now on the screen. The first one is from a graduate of our MA program, Mr. Perry, and he wants to know something related to my last question, which is, did you see any large-scale evidence of remorse from any of the responsible parties after the war?
Yeah, there are. That is a good question. And if one thinks about Chris Browning's very powerful Ordinary Men, the idea of alcohol use that you see amongst the members of Police Battalion 101, the cohort that he looked at, is very much this idea of coping, using alcohol as a coping mechanism after the killings. That this is the way they deal with the terrible things they become involved with. I do think that you can't discount that narrative, but I think that that narrative is also self-serving in some cases. So if you're interviewed after the war as to, why you became involved in these actions, you can say alcohol was what led me to do it. And what some of the viewers may or may not know is that alcohol impairment can be a mitigating factor. It can be a mitigating factor during the war for acts committed by Wehrmacht, SS, and policemen, the so-called Volltrunkenheit, where you're completely drunk in this case, can be used as a mitigating factor. It is also can be seen as a mitigating factor after the war if someone is being prosecuted. And I think, again, it's the comfortable narrative for historians, because we can't imagine some of the things that I talked about today. It's much easier to imagine ourselves thinking, well, of course you had to drink in order to be able to do that. So the idea of remorse is, I think, a very difficult one to get to, but what you very rarely see is policemen or SS men who go to a federal prosecutor themselves and say, I can't live with what I did. And we know from the number of perpetrators who go back to Germany after these events that I asked a federal prosecutor in Münster, if how many cases he knew, and he said 0. And in fact, it's a very low number. So the remorse is not a public remorse. It may be a private remorse, but it's certainly not a public remorse.
Thank you. That transitions us to an anonymous question we also have in the Q&A about Christopher Browning's Ordinary Men. And I think you've answered a bit of this, but you might want to address it more fully. The question is, does your work suggest we need to reevaluate Browning's Ordinary Men thesis? Browning argues that there's a great deal of reluctance and social coercion involved in getting these men to kill. Your work seems to suggest that most of these killers genuinely enjoyed and were unbothered by their work, and that indeed the use of alcohol was not so much a lubricant to killing, but simply another part of the party.
Yeah, and I think that's a good question. And I think when we look at Chris's work, which is, again, a very powerful work, that it looks at men, especially that day in Yosefov, where Trapp gives them the option of dropping out. And we know that only about 12 men actually took that offer. But what he also talks about is that subsequent killings became much easier. It became normalized over time. And so we see that also in the case of, I think, the Einsatzgruppen. Karl Kretschmer, who is a member of the Einsatzgruppen, who has letters that he writes back to his family that are well known. He's also interviewed by Claude Lanzmann for Shoah. Now, it doesn't make it into the 9-hour show. It's in the outtakes. And Kretschmer tells him, hey, I don't want to talk to you. And Lanzmann keeps trying to get him to talk. And he said, I'm not going to tell you anything. I'm not going to speak with you. I don't have time. But then Lanzmann says, well, yeah, wasn't it hard to do this? And Kretschmer breaks for just a second. And he says, yes, for the Neulinge, for the new guys, it was hard. And I think that this is where, Chris is right. This idea of there's an initial threshold, but what we see is once that initial threshold is crossed, that many men, it becomes normalized, a normalized killing. So there's a policeman from Vienna, who Walter Manner, who writes his wife a letter telling her they've issued me 28 bullets today. And he knows what that's for. It's for a killing action. And he tells her, I'm not sure that's going to be enough, but the next time I see you, I'll have pretty things to tell you. And 3 days later, he writes her a letter. And in that letter that he writes 3 days later, what he mentions to her is he talks to her about the first group came up and his hands were shaking. By the 10th group, he said, he was able to, take aim, shoot, no problems. And he includes a description of shooting children, babies out of the air, kind of this performative masculinity as well. And he ends that letter by saying, I now know what bloodlust is. So for a policeman from Vienna, it took him maybe 30, 40 minutes before he was fully acclimated to his duties. And I think that that's important because what that letter doesn't talk about is drinking at the site. It talks about the action, the intoxication of this violence, and then the incorporation of a game involving shooting kids out of the air or infants out of the air. I again think that this gives us an idea of the way in which the perpetrators acclimated to their actions.
Let's move on to separating out some of these perpetrators. There's a few questions that differentiate between the soldiers, the men of the Wehrmacht, and the SS in different ways. So I'll combine two of them and see if I can get these. Jessica Stratzella was asking about the average ration of alcohol for German soldiers for the Wehrmacht. And we have, let's see if I get these together. There's also a question as well about whether there were different standards for behavior between policemen, sort of ghetto guards, and soldiers, so different standards there. And Karen Horn, who's one of our presenters for tomorrow, asked sort of more broadly, was there a difference in the way the Wehrmacht and the SS used alcohol in combat versus in genocide? So could you talk more about those soldiers versus policemen differences here?
Yeah, it's, the Russian army has a vodka ration, if you will, right? We've also heard, you might have heard the pejorative use of Dutch courage. We know the grog ration in the British Navy, for example. So different militaries at different times have incorporated alcohol rations. The Germans per se, not in this case. The way that Himmler looks, the head of the SS and the police, looks at these actions is he wants his men to come back to so-called fellowship evenings, Kameradschaftsabende, as they're described. And the idea that he, writing to his commanders, is that he expects that they'll drink 1 beer, a half liter, or 2 beers, maybe a liter max. There'll be poetry, there'll be music, but the idea is that the men are not going to get involved in this kind of drunken stupor, if you will, that they're going to create camaraderie in the wake of what are very difficult types of things to do, i.e. mass murder. So that's the way he envisions it. Now, what we see on the ground is the rhetoric that he uses doesn't match the way in which men drink. So a Polish waitress who remembers how these SS groups would come back several times a week to her restaurant, and she remembers the men coming in to eat, drink, sing. And she also remembers how that they would do chariot races. They would push each other in chairs around the table. So again, performative kind of, if you will, masculinity taking place here. And she also remembers that after they'd been drinking more, they'd start reaching for her and how she had to break away from that. So we see that alcohol is incorporated, if you will, into these rituals in ways that Himmler, for example, does not approve of or would not approve of. In the case of the Wehrmacht, it really depends on the situation and the timing as to what they get. I don't think there's different drinking. What I do think, though, is we see manifestations. So Ben Shepard's book on the Wehrmacht, when he talks about rapes in the East by the Wehrmacht, by the German army, he said about 1/3 of those are gang rapes. And I talk in the book about sexual violence, and I really don't want to spend a lot of time in this forum talking about it. It's a very difficult subject. But at the same time, he says about 1/3 of those were gang rapes. And if you look at sociological literature, Peggy Sande Reeves, for example, talks about how men use gang rape not really as a performance for sexual satisfaction, it's a performance for bonding with the other men who are involved in that. And we also see that in the Japanese army. In other words, there's cases where that same dynamic is at play in World War II. So the use of this kind of male bonding, the use of alcohol and atrocity that's associated with it. So when I talk about chapters, I have a chapter in the book that focuses on the Wehrmacht. It's much more difficult to ascribe motivations to an organization that included some 18 million men during its existence than it is to a group of 100, 200,000 policemen or, an SS group that range from anywhere from 200 to 800,000 at different times, including auxiliaries. So I think that becomes a little bit more problematic, but that's where the hypermasculinity, I think, really comes to play. So we see that these expressions of masculinity that I think cross over between the SS and the police, also into the Wehrmacht, show the ways in which women are viewed, the ways in which men act. And so I think that that's where the most productive ways of thinking about these actions are. And Regina Mulhäuser, for example, has a great book that looks at sexual violence of the German army against women in the East as well. And what's really interesting to me is that a SS and police court, so German SS and police court, judge estimates that at least 50% of SS and policemen that are actually in the East are involved in either sexual relations or sexual assault of so-called inferior women, meaning either Jewish women or women from the East. And so again, that's another statistic that's done on the German side that kind of gives us an idea of the ubiquity of these actions. And as I talked about how men kept count of their killings, there are men who keep count of their sexual assaults or their sexual conquests in quotation marks here as well. So that performative nature of this masculinity comes through again.
We have a number of other questions and comments about sexual violence, but let's stay with this thread a bit because this is obviously opening up in a number of different directions. I'll follow up with a question by Raphael Scheck, who's one of our presenters tomorrow. And he writes, alcohol use and abuse was also very widespread in the Wehrmacht and probably in many other armed forces of the time, especially navies, which you've touched on a bit. Is this something relevant for combat too? I'm also thinking of Norman Ohler's work, Blitzed, and the way it stresses Pervitin. Do you see a connection? In my own research, he writes, however, I see much more alcohol and coffee use than Pervitin use.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to Raphael's talk tomorrow as well. So thank you for that. Thank you for that question. Let me start with the Pervitin because I think this is a really important point. As you mentioned, Norman Ohler's book, Blitzed in the English translation, kind of looks at Pervitin as a causal factor in these actions. And as I talked about, alcohol, I don't see as causal. It's an accompaniment. And what's really important, a point that was just mentioned in the question, is when I look at Himmler writes about everything. He is writing about these prescriptions of alcohol use and about tobacco use, for example. He gets down into mundane details. I have not seen one document where he's worried about the use or talks about the use of Pervitin or methamphetamine, Panzerschokolade, in the Vulgate terms of the Wehrmacht amongst the SS and police. So to me, that's the dog that didn't bark, because if he's not worried about it, it's not a problem. Alcohol he sees as a problem, because why is alcohol a problem? It's also a problem in the way in which SS and policemen sometimes interact with each other. So they get into fights, they pull out their weapons. So this is where he becomes very much focused on this, and these prohibitions on alcohol use or limiting alcohol use that he talks about in many cases are also indicative of how important the issue of alcohol is to him. And Pervitin is not an issue that comes up in those discussions. So I think that that's an extremely important point that is made there. That that it's not that key of an issue. To me, I would agree that looking at these behaviors, they cut across both the Wehrmacht, SS, and police in this case.
Okay, a bit of a shift here because we want to, I think, cover a number of topics. Cornelia Weiss, who's been a member of our group and is highly relevant for her own research, would like you to reflect on how you protect your mental health when you engage in work about atrocities.
Yeah, that's a good question. There are days when you kind of have to shut down your research when you do the Holocaust. David Crew, who when I gave a really early version, who's at the University of Texas, someone you may know, said, I thought I knew the worst about the Holocaust. And he said, then I listened to this presentation. It's like you pulled up the rug and there's something even worse underneath the rug. I think you have to compartmentalize this kind of research in many cases. But also to answer that question in another way, a friend of mine, Zev Weiss, who was the president of the Holocaust Educational Foundation and a survivor of Auschwitz. He was from the Hungarian Jewish population that was deported to Auschwitz in 1944. He talked about at these conferences, if a historian said, to understand this point, Zeb would immediately jump up in the middle of the presentation and say, you're a historian or you're a literature professor, you can't understand the Holocaust. And I knew intellectually what he meant because we didn't live through it. But in doing this research, it gave me a new perspective in thinking about why he did that. Because the things I'm talking about that for all of us sound so horrific that we don't really even want to look sometimes, that was the lived experience of people who experienced the Holocaust. And in some cases, the daily lived experience of men and women who were in the Holocaust. And this is one of the things that prevents us from really understanding. It's one of the things because this is beyond our ability to conceptualize some of these behaviors. And that, I think, is an important point. It gave me a new insight into what I thought Zev meant by that. But I do think that in doing this kind of research, it is one of those types of subjects that you really have to think about and sometimes back away from as you're dealing with it, just like sexual violence. But it's an important subject because, as you know, Cornelia, if we were talking about that subject 25 years ago, we had a much different version of sexual violence amongst Wehrmacht and SS and policemen as quote unquote Rassenschande, racial defilement. So it wasn't happening, and it's generations of really female historians that come into this picture and kind of say, well, let's complicate, let's look at that assumption. And what we found out is that assumption was not a good assumption, that we were making, we were making an assumption that really was wrong. And so I think it's important to correct that historical record in that way as well.
Okay, let me combine, we have some threads still unexplored, but let me combine a question from Muqing Wen and from Grant Harward, who will be presenting tomorrow. And the question is basically about the celebrations, about the festa that you described. What were they celebrating? And then Grant, from his own research on Romania and the Romanian army, notes that for the Romanian army, alcohol was often part of special rations for holidays on the front. And his question related to that is, do we see a pattern linked to various holidays and surges of alcohol-fueled violence in this story? Is there a calendar here of celebrations?
Well, I do think that we see from in the case of SS and policemen, we do see some cases where these actions take place on Jewish holidays, for example. And it looks like I may have lost you. Jadwiga, did I drop out of the feed?
I've still got you.
Oh, okay. Okay, good. My computer is showing me I'm on a default browser, so I can't see you, but yeah, that's good. As long as you can see me, that's great. So we have Jewish survivors who talk about how Jewish holy days, for example, become days in which some of these staged actions take place. So that's one thing that we see, the incorporation. What we know with pogroms and pogromatic violence in the East before the Nazis, so in the early 20th century, for example, that many of them happened during either Christmas and especially Easter. And it would be after celebrations of Easter. So this idea of anti-Semitic violence tied to drinking and also tied to religious ceremonies that talk about the death of Christ, the murder of Christ, if you will, the killing of Christ, and then the assumption that it's the Jews who are at fault. So this integration, if you will, of drinking and violence against Jews has a longer history in that case. And I'm not sure if the Romanian, I think from Grant's book, which I highly recommend, it also kind of sees some of those connections in that way. So I think that that's definitely something that is part of this discussion. And what was the other part of that question? Because I was staring, I'm staring at a screen where I can't see you, so I kind of lost my train of thought.
It was about holidays, what was being celebrated and when it was being celebrated.
Okay, great. Yeah. So I think what's being celebrated is camaraderie, is one part of that, and being tough or hard men. And there are, so in the Kretschmer letters, for example, he says after the events that the evenings after, they would play cards and they would drink. And what he said is you couldn't not go to those events afterwards. And that's really an interesting point, because if you didn't show up at these post-killing, if you will, get-togethers, it was not seen as you were saying, I'm not interested in drinking with you tonight. It was also seen by the other members of the group that you were stating kind of implicitly that you disagreed with the actions that they were involved in. So you see also in the way in which men are negotiating these events as part of being in the group, as part of expressing their own toughness, their own hardness in this case. So I think that that kind of gets to this idea of it's celebratory in terms of the types of events that are taking place, but the incorporation of celebratory ritual at the actual killing sites. I think the incorporation of music, for example, is one of the cases where you see how the staging of the murder itself can be celebratory and celebrated. Also, the boasting at the bar afterwards is a celebratory kind of ritual that takes place.
Okay, if you're still bearing with me here, I'm going to consolidate two last questions, and I will, for those who are sensitive to the topic, the last one I ask will be about sexual violence. So for those who want to opt out of that, fair warning there. The last point you made actually brought up Daniel Giblin's question, and there are a few questions that basically ask different ways of asking about official policy here and how much this is a top-down matter, how much the logistics are being supported by the command elite. So Daniel asks, what's the official policy regarding excessive consumption? Was there any official censure of alcohol, excessive alcohol consumption? And then, of course, he was asking about something you just mentioned, which is, does anyone ever get to opt out? And that relates to something that Mary Catherine Barbier asked, and also David Harrisville, which is how much is this a top-down matter where the top of the Wehrmacht or the top of the SS is rationing out alcohol, is making sure it gets to these units, or how much is actually plunder on the ground? And Catherine Barbier also brought up the contrast with the British things. So I think the real heart of the question here is who's directing this? Is this on the ground, bottom-up plunder by the men doing the massacring, or has this been anticipated? Is this something their commanders are putting in place?
Well, yeah, those are some really excellent questions, and I would say that the way in which we see mass murder take place in the East, especially amongst the Einsatzkommandos, amongst some of the police battalions, it's a very decentralized process, and that's important to remember because what people in Berlin are saying, certainly Himmler's rhetoric, is not being transferred down on the ground at the local level in the East. These men are making decisions on their own, and they're free in many cases to use initiative to do these types of activities, if you will, on their own. Now, excessive alcohol use can get people into trouble. There are individuals who are actually punished for excessive alcohol use. But that becomes, again, at the discretion of the local commander normally. And in the case of someone like Himmler, before the war, certainly he is worried about guys like Jeckeln who get stopped drunk driving, and he admits to Himmler he'd had several beers, he'd had schnapps, he'd had wine, but he said, he said to Himmler, the reason how I was drinking, it's not so much the amount. He goes, it was in a camaraderie, as building camaraderie in this group. And so Himmler kind of lets him off. There are guys, though, that have alcohol problems. And what Himmler does with those individuals is actually at Buchenwald, the SS has its own rehabilitation unit there where men go to detox, if you will. Himmler also uses the idea of men having to state on their word of honor that they would not drink for a year or 3 years. Now, what's really interesting with that, when the war starts, those alcohol prohibitions, he sets them aside. So he says the war kind of creates a different environment. Now, he does also say in his kind of notorious speech at Posen, at Poznan, that he talks about how we can't afford to lose people to alcohol because we're losing too many people in battle. But in fact, again, he's making a statement that is divorced from the reality of what's taking place on the ground. So the bottom up, if you will, versus the top down influence, I think is a good way of describing this. Men who are in the zone of exception, they can choose to do these things like sexual violence or sexual assault against Jewish women or against Slavic women, Polish women, Russian women, Belarusian women, whoever. That's not something that they would have been allowed to do, but they're making the decision to do it at the local level, and they're becoming involved in that. Certainly, plunder and the idea that alcohol is a luxury good in the East is certainly also part of that dynamic. So men who are in battle, who are involved in these actions as well, that they seek out alcohol as kind of, if you will, as something for their entertainment, for their own use. So that all comes together. But I think the key point in this conversation is that we see the decentralized nature and the ability of individuals to do what they choose to do. And where this comes into perpetrator motivation, I think is really important because, Himmler talks about he wants his men to remain decent, right? He wants them to be decent mass murderers. But the kind of behaviors we're seeing are behaviors that men are choosing to engage in. And I think that really gets us an insight into how the East, this literal and metaphorical intoxication, come together in these actions of murder.
That makes a good transition to our last question, which some people might not want to stay for, but that combines some things that were raised by a number of our questioners that you made reference to. You have a whole chapter in the book on this, and that's the matter of sexual violence. Boyan Majstorovic is asking about this, and Jim Dingaman as well. And the question is really about motivation and sexual violence and the role of alcohol. So Boyan asks, you argue that the Holocaust would have been possible without alcohol, that it's not causal. But what about sexual violence that accompanies the genocide against the Jews? Is that causal? What's the role of alcohol here? And Jim is asking more broadly about the legacy of this into the post-war and how we remember these events. So what should we do with sexual violence as a part of this topic to end on a light note?
Yeah. Well, Boyan is having his own book that comes out that's going to really deal with the Russian army, the Red Army, moving into these occupied territories as they move towards Germany. And I've had the good fortune of reading that, and he discusses how alcohol plays a key role in which Red Army soldiers get drunk and then they become involved in sexual violence. Certainly, some of the viewers will be familiar with A Woman in Berlin, the diary of a woman who remembers these Russian forces, Red Army forces coming into Berlin. And we know about the mass rapes that occurred in Germany. And in her description of the event, she says it's alcohol that causes these men to kind of come off the rails, if you will, and engage in sexual violence. I do think that there is a disinhibition that's part of this process of sexual violence that we see, that drinking can lead to disinhibition and facilitation of violence. And I talk about that in the book to a degree. But the other thing that I talked about is how it's used as a part of male bonding. And I think the other thing that's important to remember here is the way in which, and Claudia Kuntz and others who have looked at kind of gender relations in Nazi Germany, the way in which women are seen by German men, this objectification, if you will, the idea of one's sexual prowess also being part of one's masculinity. I think that also that mindset, that kind of, if you will, psychological predisposition to think about women in those terms is also part of what we see here. Now, when SS and police courts look at some of these actions, one of the things that they take into consideration in dealing with so-called sexual relations, whether consensual or forced, is that, well, the men don't have access to women. So this is again used as one of those mitigating factors in some cases when they look at it. That's less so when it's male on male sex. So homosexuality in this case, or acts of male sex between males. That's seen in a different way. And Jeffrey Giles has some really good work on that. So I think that that certainly alcohol can lead to acts of violence, but the way in which the group is often involved, as I talked about with Ben Shepard's observation of a third of these rapes are gang rapes, that it shows us that the way in which it's about the group actually being involved in the actions against others. So I think that that's an important point. And again, to kind of the last part of that question about what it means for men who come back after the war, I think that again is a topic that should be explored in more detail. One of the things that I will say, and I briefly mentioned this in the book, is that if we look at what happened in the genocide in Rwanda in 1992, we see some of the very same dynamics I'm talking about in Nazi Germany. With respect to sexual violence and alcohol use in the Balkans, we see manifestations of that as well in the Balkans. So I think that there are some areas in other genocides, acts of mass atrocity and mass violence, in which the use of inebriants and alcohol in particular can give us some further ways to think about the ways in which it's used by perpetrators in general.
Thank you. Obviously, there's a lot of things to think about there. But I think we've covered plenty for today. And so what's left to me is to recommend to everyone who hasn't read it yet, this book by Dr. Jadwiga Biskupska, Drunk on Genocide. which is not light reading, but nevertheless, I think very much worthwhile. I'd like to thank him today for his talk, for speaking on this book, and for answering so many questions. I know many are left over. And therefore, I will offer a pitch for attending our workshop tomorrow, in which we'll be discussing some of the aspects of what he's talking about in some other geographies as well: sexual violence, massacre and its perpetration, the mistreatment of prisoners of war, and then the legacies of participating in these sorts of atrocity, and all are certainly welcome to join us there. I'd also like to thank my department here at Sam Houston State University and the graduate program in our track, particularly on war and violence, and our very fine students within it, and my fellow group members in the Second World War Research Group North America, who will reconvene with us tomorrow. And of course, I'd like to thank Dr. Westermann for sharing his work and for sharing his thoughts with us today. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jadwiga. I appreciate it. And I'll see you tomorrow.
Yes, you will. Well, a good afternoon and good night to all the rest of you. Thank you so much for joining us, and please join us in further programming from Sam Houston State University and the Second World War Research Group North America. Bye-bye now.